What if one of the most controversial numbers in biblical prophecy was never really about numbers at all? What if 7 times was read for centuries as a warning about punishment, but later interpreters began seeing something far more disturbing inside it? A timeline, 2,520 years. And now, that disputed chronology is being connected by some interpreters to one of the longest and most painful experiences in modern history, the Black Diaspora. That does not prove the prophecy, it does not make every date fit, and it certainly does not give us permission to turn history into numerology. But it raises a question that is much harder to dismiss. Why have generations of readers looked at the same biblical phrase and seen a pattern of exile, scattering, bondage, identity loss, and delayed restoration? And why does that question feel especially urgent now? Because once you start tracing the argument, the story moves from an ancient biblical warning into the middle passage: slavery, colonialism, Jim Crow, cultural erasure, and the modern recovery of Black historical memory. That is where this gets uncomfortable. Because the real question is not simply whether the number is correct. The real question is whether the pattern people are trying to describe is bigger than the number itself. What we are doing instead is entering a controversial interpretive framework, one that has fascinated preachers, prophetic readers, Black historical interpreters, and generations of people trying to understand whether the long arc of diaspora suffering follows more than an economic or political logic. The framework turns on one severe biblical phrase, 7 times. If you read the covenant warnings in Leviticus 26 in the most straightforward scholarly sense, the phrase usually means intensified punishment, sevenfold, not necessarily a coded timeline. Even many conservative biblical scholars reject the idea that it predicts a literal 520-year countdown. They argue that the Hebrew wording points to severity rather than a prophetic calendar, and that the passage itself does not provide a fixed starting or ending point. That caution matters. We should say it clearly before we go any deeper, but caution does not erase influence, because across centuries of historicist interpretation, the phrase 7 times was also read another way: 7 prophetic years, 360 days per prophetic year. 7 multiplied by 360, 2,520 days. Some interpreters then apply a day for a year principle drawn from their readings of Daniel and Revelation, turning those symbolic days into years, 2,520 years. A number severe enough to feel less like arithmetic and more like a sentence. This is the number at the center of our journey. For some readers, it is a rejected speculation. For others, a devotional curiosity. For still others, especially among communities searching for hidden continuity between biblical exile and the Black historical experience, it becomes something more haunting, a possible chronology of dispersion, humiliation, bondage, identity fracture, and delayed restoration. Not proven in the manner of a laboratory result, not accepted by mainstream historians as a governing law of history, but persistent, magnetic, difficult to dismiss precisely because the rhythm of suffering it seeks to describe feels so tragically real, and that is where we must move carefully. Because the danger in subjects like this is not only gullibility, it is also simplification. One kind of simplification says that every pattern is prophecy and every date is destiny. Another says that because a theory is contested, it has no interpretive value at all. Both mistakes close the door too fast. A chronology can be theologically disputed and still historically revealing. Revealing not because it mechanically predicts everything, but because it gives language to how communities have experienced repetition, discipline, displacement, and deferred recognition. So tonight we will walk under several kinds of light. The light of the biblical text itself, which is stern, covenantal, and difficult. The light of interpretation, where numbers expand beyond the original wording and become timelines. The light of documented history, where the transatlantic slave trade, colonial domination, and Jim Crow can be examined through documented material systems of violence that do not require prophetic explanation in order to be real. And the light of collective memory, where people living through long dispossession begin to ask whether history has been random or structured or both. That final question is what gives this topic its charge, because if there really is a pattern here, whether divinely ordained, interpretively imposed, psychologically recognized, or some unsettling combination of all three, then the story of the Black Diaspora is not only a political tragedy, a panin pichibiol minspeden. It is also a chronological drama. A drama in which captivity is not merely something done to a people, but something timed, measured, stretched across generations until the punishment enters language, family, economy, religion, self-perception, and the architecture of the modern world. And if that is true, then 2026 feels significant to many people, not because every scholar agrees a countdown has expired, but because our moment is crowded with signs of historical reckoning. Digital archives are opening family histories that were once sealed. Genealogical research is reconnecting descendants to names, units, counties, and ports. Black historical consciousness is being reshaped by global media, international protest, archival recovery, and a widening refusal to let old narratives explain the present. What was once whispered in small circles now circulates at scale. Something is surfacing. At the same time, the pressure of this moment cannot be understood only as information overload. It is also emotional accumulation. Families that carried silence for decades are now speaking in different tones. Younger generations are less patient with stories that begin at captivity and end at symbolic inclusion. Researchers are finding receipts where rumor once stood. Local memorials are changing the language of towns that used to hide their own foundations. Across sermons, classrooms, community discussions, and late-night private searches, people are beginning to test whether the old fragments belong to one larger sequence. That test does not prove the prophecy, but it does push the script closer to the scale this subject requires. The mood is no longer only curiosity, it is pressure. Pressure to connect what had been kept apart. Pressure to ask whether a pattern this long can really be called accidental. Pressure to imagine that a people can become historically literate enough to stop living only in reaction. And once that pressure builds, the listener is no longer simply consuming information. They are standing at the edge of implication. If the pattern is real, then inherited explanations are too small. If the pattern is even partly real, then the future demands a different seriousness than the past required. Something is surfacing. Whether you call it prophecy, memory, or unfinished history, something is surfacing. And that is why this conversation matters now. Because there comes a point in every long historical night when people begin to suspect that what they inherited as bad luck was actually structure. That what they were taught to call failure may have been discipline inside somebody else's order. That what looked like scattered tragedies were in fact connected stages of a larger experience. Expulsion, transport, renaming, labor extraction, legal humiliation, cultural erasure, psychological partition, and then, at the far end of the cycle, a dangerous new thing, recognition. Because the first thing we have to understand is the severity of the number itself. The number enters the room with the force of a verdict. 2,520. Not a symbol that floats, a symbol that counts. And that is part of what has made it so compelling to interpreters across time. The classic route to the number is simple enough to state, even if its theological legitimacy is disputed. In Leviticus 26, within a series of covenant curses, the text warns that if the people continue in disobedience, punishment will intensify 7 times. Many modern translations understand the phrase as sevenfold or 7 times over, pointing to intensified punishment. The surrounding chapter is built on a conditional covenant structure. Obedience brings blessing, rebellion brings escalating discipline, exile and desolation, but repentance also leaves open the possibility of mercy. In that reading, the passage is moral and covenantal, not an encoded clock. Yet interpreters who favor a prophetic chronology take another step. They treat 7 times, not as intensity, but as duration. In some historicist and apocalyptic interpretations, a time is treated as a prophetic year of 360 days. 7 times then becomes 7 multiplied by 360, 2,520 days. Apply the day for a year principle familiar to some historicist readings of prophecy, and the result is 2,520 years. The moment that move is made, the passage changes genre. What was once a severe warning becomes a timeline. What was once a covenant curse becomes a long exile measured across empires. What was once a chapter in Leviticus becomes a key that some readers try to fit into Assyria, Babylon, Rome, colonial expansion, the Atlantic slave system, and modern Black awakening. Whether the key fits is exactly the controversy, and controversy matters here because if we do not state it plainly, we risk sounding certain where certainty does not exist. Scholarly critics of the 520-year reading have made several arguments. They note that the Hebrew in Leviticus does not explicitly include a noun meaning times, the way Daniel 4 does when speaking of 7 times for Nebuchadnezzar. They point out that Leviticus 26 gives no fixed start date, no explicit terminus, and no direct instruction to convert days into years. They observe that the chapter's curses already manifested in Israel's history in multiple waves, long before later interpreters tried to assemble one giant chronometric arc. And they remind us that many traditions most associated with prophetic calculation have themselves rejected Leviticus 26 as a legitimate source for a literal 520-year prophecy. That critique cannot simply be brushed aside, but neither can we ignore why the number persisted. Because people do not return to a disputed chronology for no reason. They return to it when ordinary historical language begins to feel insufficient for the scale of what they are trying to name. Exile is one thing if it lasts a generation. It becomes something else if it appears to stretch across kingdoms, oceans, plantations, ghettos, prisons, classrooms, and screens. At that scale, people begin to crave structure. Not because structure removes pain, but because it prevents pain from collapsing into nonsense. That is one of the unspoken emotional powers of prophetic chronology. It says, this did not happen without shape. This did not happen because your ancestors were merely unlucky. This did not happen because violence appeared and disappeared at random. There is a sequence here, a discipline, a pattern severe enough to humble, yet structured enough to outlast despair. This is especially powerful in communities that have had their official past broken apart. When names have been stripped, when languages have been interrupted, when lineages are hard to trace, when family memory reaches a wall, when the archive contains you only as cargo, labor, pathology, or problem. In such conditions, chronology becomes more than a theory. It becomes a counter-archive, a way of saying that what the ships scattered, time itself may still remember. And that brings us to the argument's most dramatic move, the attempt to connect ancient kingdom collapse with the later transatlantic dispersal of black peoples across the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and beyond. Different schools make that move differently. Some start the 520-year count from Northern Kingdom crises tied to Assyria, some from Southern Kingdom humiliation, some align the curse with the fall or subjugation of ancient Israelite polities. Some embed the theory within Black Israelite traditions or adjacent interpretive movements that identify the Black Diaspora with biblical Israel in exile. Others do not adopt the identity claim fully, but still use the chronology symbolically, as if the number names a larger civilizational chastening associated with Black dispossession. The dates vary. That variability should sober us, because when a prophecy produces many competing starting points, one must ask whether we are seeing hidden precision or interpretive hunger. Still, even hunger tells the truth about something. It tells the truth about what communities feel is missing from official history, moral scale. Official history can explain the transatlantic slave trade through maritime technology, labor demand, imperial competition, sugar, tobacco, capital accumulation, and the collapse of indigenous populations in the Americas. All of that is true, all of that matters. The transatlantic slave trade became the largest long-distance coerced migration in the early modern world. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported, many died before or during the crossing, and survivors entered legal systems that treated enslaved people as inheritable property. The historical record is sufficiently horrific without prophecy, but official history cannot always answer the ache beneath the facts. Why this scale? Why this duration? Why this degree of humiliation and memory fracture? Why does the catastrophe seem not to end when one system ends, but to mutate into another, slavery into peonage, peonage into segregation, segregation into redlining, mass disenfranchisement, police violence, educational dispossessions, and global anti-blackness? At what point does sequential oppression begin to feel less like isolated policy and more like a drawn-out sentence? That is the psychological opening into which the 520-year idea steps. Not first as proof, as explanation. And explanation, when official narratives have denied a people dignity, can become almost sacramental. This is why the framework often speaks in the language of punishment rather than misfortune. Punishment implies intention. It implies relationship. It implies that history has not become meaningless, only terrible. For devout readers, that distinction is everything. A curse, however severe, still belongs to a world in which God is present. Random brutality is colder, more difficult to survive spiritually, yet there is a danger here as well. To read diaspora history exclusively as punishment can become its own wound. It can place unbearable blame on ancestors already brutalized by empire. It can spiritualize white supremacy instead of indicting it. It can make collective suffering look deserved. It can flatten the many African peoples, cultures, kingdoms, and lineages carried into the Atlantic into one single biblical category without enough historical humility. So, if we are going to walk this road at all, we have to do so with discipline. We have to distinguish between interpretive usefulness and demonstrable proof, between theological meaning and empirical evidence, between what a chronology helps people articulate and what a chronology can establish beyond dispute. That distinction is not the enemy of the script. It is what gives the script integrity, because a strong narration does not become stronger by pretending controversy is certainty. It becomes stronger by allowing the audience to feel the tension honestly. Here is the honest tension. The 520-year reading is not mainstream biblical scholarship. It is not universally accepted, even among people who take prophecy seriously. Its dating systems vary. Its links to diaspora identity are deeply contested. And yet the emotional and interpretive power of the framework persists, because the Black historical experience does seem to move in long, repeating cycles of removal, renaming, labor extraction, legal degradation, psychological attack, and delayed restoration. That repetition is real whether or not the number is. And once a people begin to count repetition, they inevitably begin to ask whether the repetition itself has a date. That question is what brings 2026 into view. For some interpreters, 2026 is surfacing in global consciousness because various start date calculations now seem to be converging near a symbolic threshold, not always mathematically in the same way, not always with clean agreement, but enough that the year starts to feel charged in sermons, online discourse, podcasts, study groups, and digital communities of historical reinterpretation. The date becomes a magnet for expectancy. But expectancy alone is not what makes 2026 meaningful. The year also sits inside a broader historical atmosphere. Institutions dedicated to African American and diaspora memory are expanding digital collections. Genealogical research tools are allowing descendants to push family histories further back into the 19th century and sometimes beyond. The global language of Black self-determination, reparative justice, anti-colonial comparison, and archival recovery has become more accessible than at any other time in human history. In other words, even if no one believed a single word of the 520-year prophecy theory, the conditions for a chronology of awakening are stronger now than they were a generation ago. That is the paradox. A disputed prophetic number and a documented digital historical awakening begin to overlap. And once they overlap, the year no longer appears as mere date. It appears as threshold. Thresholds are always dangerous, because at a threshold, old stories either collapse or deepen. If the number is empty, then the fascination with it will eventually dissolve back into the noise of speculative timelines. But if the number has served as a container for a deeper historical truth, namely that the Black diaspora has been living through an unusually long and structured experience of displacement and mental siege, then the surface debate over arithmetic may be less important than the deeper shift it accompanies. People are beginning to ask different questions. Not only who enslaved us, not only where the ships sailed, not only what laws followed, but what sequence held all of that together and why that sequence now seems to be cracking open. That crack is where the rest of this story begins. Once a chronology begins to feel plausible, the next question is not when it starts, it is how it works. What does punishment look like when stretched across centuries? Does it strike all at once? Does it announce itself with a single empire and a single decree? Or does it unfold in phases, each one material enough to document and symbolic enough to echo older warnings about exile, scattering, loss of name, loss of land, loss of language, and subjection under foreign powers? For interpreters who map the 7 times onto the Black diaspora experience, The Middle Passage is the first undeniable chamber of that punishment. Not necessarily the beginning of all suffering. Africa and the ancient world had their own wars, conquests, dynastic collapses, and internal complexities, but the beginning of a specifically Atlantic form of historical descent, a descent in which movement itself becomes violence. The ships are essential here, not only because they transported millions, because they transformed persons into transit. The Middle Passage is often described in logistical terms, the second leg of the triangular trade, the maritime transfer of enslaved Africans to the Americas, the central artery of a plantation economy hungry for labor after demographic catastrophe among indigenous peoples. Those descriptions are accurate. They are also not enough. The ship is not just a vehicle, it is a machine for reorganizing reality. On the ship, homeland becomes memory, kin becomes uncertainty, language becomes noise unless shared with someone close enough to hear, the body becomes inventory, the horizon becomes sentence, and time changes character. Days stop belonging to ordinary life. They become endurance units. Survive this morning, survive this smell, survive this heat, survive this chaining, survive this thirst, survive this woman's scream, survive this child's silence. Survive the conversion of the sea from root to grave. When later generations speak of a curse or punishment, they often do so because the Atlantic crossing feels like more than transportation. It feels liturgical in the darkest possible sense, a ritual of unmaking, not total unmaking. Nothing human is ever erased that cleanly, but enough unmaking to generate a new historical condition. This is why the first phase of the so-called 7 times punishment is sometimes described not simply as slavery, but as displacement into social death. The phrase is severe. It should be used with care, yet it captures something vital. Enslavement in the Atlantic world did not only exploit labor, it aggressively severed recognized personhood. It removed legal standing, attacked kinship continuity, subordinated religious and linguistic inheritance, and placed black existence inside systems designed to make ancestry difficult to retain, except through fragments. In that sense, the first punishment is movement combined with erasure. A people can be conquered and still remain locally legible. The Middle Passage tries something colder. It relocates and scrambles. It turns distance into method. And method matters because it reveals that the violence was not incidental. From the 16th through the 19th centuries, the transatlantic slave trade became the largest long-distance coerced movement of people in recorded history. Roughly 12.5 million Africans were shipped, and around 10.7 million survived the crossing into the Americas. Vast numbers were marched internally before reaching the coast. Vast numbers died before any ledger could stabilize their lives into countable property. Entire commercial systems matured around that movement. Insurance, shipping, finance, plantation expansion, commodity speculation, imperial treaties, port administration. For interpreters using this framework, few historical episodes appear more devastatingly coherent as a first phase. Yet even here, coherence must not become simplification. The Black Diaspora cannot be reduced to one people or one route. The trade drew from many African regions, nations, languages, and political contexts. The destinations varied. Brazil absorbed a massive share. The Caribbean became one of the trade's infernos. Spanish America, North America, Cuba, French colonies, and other Atlantic zones each imposed distinct legal and demographic worlds. The suffering was connected, but not identical. A script that pretends otherwise gains dramatic unity at the expense of historical truth. So how do we preserve both scope and nuance? By recognizing that the chronology, if it is to mean anything, does not erase difference. It tracks pattern across difference, and the pattern is unmistakable. Capture, transport, renaming, commodification, generational dislocation, the conversion of memory into something partial, endangered, and expensive to keep. Weed. This is where ancient socio-cultural warnings begin to resonate for people who read diaspora history through a biblical lens. The warnings in covenant literature are not merely about military defeat. They are about subjection among foreign nations, fear, dislocation, agricultural failure, humiliation before enemies, and the loss of stable inheritance. Whether one identifies the diaspora directly with biblical Israel or uses the language more analogically, The emotional resonance is obvious. The long Atlantic ordeal can feel like the modern theater in which old warnings found new embodiment. But the second phase begins almost immediately, because displacement alone does not secure an empire. A captive population must also be cognitively managed. This is where physical bondage turns toward mental bondage. On plantations and in colonial settlements, the goal was not only to force labor from bodies, it was to manufacture durable categories: master and slave, civilized and savage, white and black, Christian and heathen, legal person and inheritable thing. None of these categories was naturally obvious. All had to be taught, repeated, ritualized and defended. Violence alone could not sustain them. The imagination had to be recruited. So names changed, kinship terms changed, religious worlds were attacked, though never wholly extinguished. Languages were suppressed, broken, blended, or pushed underground. Calendars changed, labor rhythms changed. Geography itself became strange. A people whose memory once ran across rivers, compounds, markets, shrines, fields, lineages, and oral histories, was now being trained to navigate auction blocks, overseers, passes, punishments, quotas, and denominations imposed from above. This is why identity erasure is not a secondary wound in diaspora history. It is central. A system extracting labor on that scale cannot allow the enslaved to remain fully narrated by their own past. Too much continuity is dangerous. Too much naming is dangerous. Too much ancestral memory is dangerous. Too much unbroken relation is dangerous. If we were to translate that into the language of punishment cycles, we might say the first phase strikes the body through transport, and the second phase strikes the mind through misnaming. The body is moved. The person is recoded. That recoding reaches far beyond religion. It shapes economics. Modern capitalism did not merely coexist with anti-black bondage, it was materially shaped by it. Plantation wealth, commodity chains, shipping routes, commercial credit, and early industrial demand all helped turn the Atlantic world into a machine whose efficiencies depended on black dispossessions. Mental bondage, then, is not only internalized inferiority, it is the ideological framework required for whole economies to treat human reduction as reasonable. People must believe certain things to profit at that scale. They must believe that African lives are fungible, that family severance is administratively regrettable but economically acceptable, that some populations are naturally suited to labor, that Christian rhetoric can coexist with permanent domination, that history belongs to the conqueror's calendar. Those beliefs do not remain outside the enslaved. Over time, under pressure, fragments of them can be internalized by the oppressed as well, not because the oppressed are weak, but because total systems seek total pedagogy. They train expectation, they train caution, they train aspiration, they train what seems possible. This is the sense in which punishment becomes mental, not simply chains on the ankle, but limits inside imagination. And yet imagination never surrenders cleanly. Even in the first phase of Atlantic bondage, counter-memory survives. Through religion adapted and transformed, through song, through naming practices hidden inside official names, through maroon communities, through rebellion, through the preservation of craft, foodways, funerary customs, rhythms, oral wisdom, herbal knowledge, and the stubborn insistence that kin can be remade where kin has been shattered. Any script about mental bondage that forgets resistance becomes dishonest, because the mind was attacked, yes, but the mind was also fighting. This matters for chronology as well. A punishment cycle, if that is what one believes history to be, is never simply passive suffering. It is also the space in which a people learn what cannot be fully taken from them. Ironically, the depth of the attempted erasure often reveals the depth of what had to be erased. If the system spent so much energy renaming, it was because names mattered. If it spent so much energy banning assembly, drumming, literacy, travel, worship, and landholding, it was because continuity mattered. If it attacked family formation, it was because kinship mattered. Domination tells you what it fears by the intensity of what it destroys. That insight becomes essential once we start mapping the 7 times into epochs. Because the pattern is not simply suffering followed by relief. It is suffering that mutates. Movement becomes bondage. Bondage becomes law. Law becomes custom. Custom becomes psychology. Psychology becomes market structure. And the market, once stabilized, begins to look like nature. That is perhaps the cruelest part of the whole process. A system built by force eventually disguises itself as reality. And when a people wake up inside that disguise, they often need more than economics to explain what happened to them. They need chronology. They need sequence. They need a story strong enough to hold ships, scriptures, sugar, ports, census books, churches, barracoons, auction houses, prisons, and schoolrooms in a single field of vision. That is what the 7 times framework attempts to provide. It may not be historically demonstrable in the narrowest scholarly sense, but emotionally, spiritually, and rhetorically, it makes one terrible claim that is hard to ignore. The middle passage was not only a route, it was the opening gate of a long night. If the 7 times are to function as more than atmosphere, they need shape, they need stages, not because the Bible gives us an indexed list called the 7 diaspora epochs. It does not. Any such map is retrospective and interpretive, but human beings understand long suffering through segmentation. We look back and realize that the night had chambers, different laws, different technologies, different masks. The pain was continuous, yet not identical from century to century. So let us map the framework the way many serious interpreters of long oppression instinctively do, not as an infallible chart, but as a disciplined narrative of mutation. Epoch 1, Dislodging. This is the phase in which covenant memory, kingdom collapse, and the image of scattered sovereignty enter the story. In theological readings, this is where the original warning is lodged: disobedience, defeat, loss of land, subjugation to foreign powers. Whether one identifies the Black Diaspora literally with ancient Israel or uses that script typologically, the first epoch establishes the pattern that history can move from protected inheritance to national fragmentation. Before the ships, before the plantations, before racial capitalism, there is the template of a people uprooted from order. This first epoch matters because it gives later readers a grammar of catastrophe, a grammar that says ruin can be covenantal, a grammar that says exile can become intergenerational, a grammar that keeps later suffering from seeming unprecedented, even when its modern scale is unmatched. Epoch 2, Seizure and Passage. This is where the Atlantic world begins to mirror the old language of scattering with terrifying material force. Raids, wars, sails, inland marches, forts, barracoons, and finally the Middle Passage. This epoch corresponds to the historical transition from local vulnerability to mass oceanic removal. The theological language here is exile. The economic language is commodification. The human language is fracture. Whole populations are not merely conquered. They are reorganized into a traffic system. Epoch 3, Plantation Captivity and Productive Curse. Once the body arrives, the system's next task is permanence. Ascension shore, sugar islands, tobacco fields, rice coasts, cotton empires, domestic slavery, breeding regimes, legal inheritance of status, anti-literacy laws, patrols, punishment codes. This is the epoch in which suffering becomes infrastructural. It is no longer event, it is economy. In a 7 times framework, this is where punishment ceases to look episodic and begins to look designed for reproduction. The enslaved do not simply labor, they reproduce wealth, hierarchy, and modernity itself. This is why so many interpreters feel that the curse cannot be understood only in spiritual terms. It has a balance sheet. Epoch 4, Colonial Codification and Global Rule. Although Atlantic slavery is already colonial, this epoch emphasizes the wider global consolidation of white imperial order. Here, black dispossession is linked not only to plantations, but to the entire architecture of colonial sovereignty, European control of African territories, missionary paternalism, extractive rule, legal dualism, and a world map increasingly divided by race and empire. The Black Diaspora and the African continent are both caught in the same expanding field, one under dispersion, the other under partition, occupation, and imperial administration. If one was searching for the 7-fold intensification of punishment, this phase certainly qualifies. The injury is no longer local to a few plantation zones. It becomes planetary. Epoch 5, Emancipation without restoration. This is the epoch many chronologies find most psychologically devastating, because here the chain is broken, but the sentence is not. Legal slavery weakens, is abolished, or is formally dismantled in one region after another. Yet freedom arrives inside hostile property arrangements, racial terror, debt peonage, convict leasing, disenfranchisement, apprenticeship schemes, migration coercion, land theft, and memory systems still controlled by former masters or imperial powers. This is the epoch of half-release. Enough freedom to create expectation, not enough justice to convert freedom into sovereignty. In biblical terms, this feels like a people brought near the edge of relief while still carrying the social residue of punishment. That is often worse than open captivity, because open captivity at least names the prison. Epoch 6, segregation, Jim Crow, and the colonial high noon. Then this is where our timeline grows especially sharp. In the United States, the end of Reconstruction gives way to Jim Crow. Late 19th and early 20th century laws and customs built to prevent black and white people from meeting as equals in schools, transport, public spaces, housing, and civic life. In the wider world, the same period witnesses the ferocious expansion and hardening of European colonial rule across Africa and elsewhere. This is why interpreters often place Jim Crow and global colonialism in the same chamber. Both represent the maturation of racial governance after the abolition of legal chattel slavery. The system has learned a new skill. It no longer needs chains everywhere. It can classify, it can segregate, it can police movement with paperwork, it can force labor through debt or low wages, it can pathologize resistance, it can call its barriers civilization. This is also the epoch in which the mental component of punishment deepens. The child enters school through hostile history. The worker enters labor markets designed for containment. The family enters neighborhoods mapped by exclusion. The traveler enters transport through humiliation. The church enters public life under constant negotiation with the state. A people begin to internalize not only trauma, but timing. Delay becomes ordinary. Deferral becomes normal. Citizenship becomes conditional. Epoch 7, formal integration, continuing disparity, and the psychological veil. This is perhaps the most difficult epoch to narrate because it looks freer than what came before, and in real ways it is. The legal pillars of segregation are challenged and broken. Civil rights victories alter public law. Anti-colonial movements win flags, parliaments, and formal independence across Africa and the Caribbean. New institutions arise, new languages of black pride, Pan-Africanism, cultural reclamation, and academic study become more available. Yet inequality mutates again. Carceral systems expand, wealth gaps harden, extractive economic relations persist under neo-colonial terms, media stereotypes globalize, education remains uneven, memory remains fragmented, color lines shift without disappearing. This is the epoch many people today feel themselves exiting, or perhaps only finally diagnosing. It is the epoch in which the punishment grows subtle enough to masquerade as normal life, and that subtlety is why the language of the veil lifting has become so powerful. Because within this interpretive framework, the later stage of a long discipline may be imagined not as obvious chains, but as misrecognition, living inside a system whose rules you partly see and partly breathe. Experiencing fragmentation as ordinary, calling inherited disorientation by softer names, underperformance, bad policy, family breakdown, cultural pathology, market failure. The veil is the inability to see connectedness. The shift begins when scattered symptoms start to look like one long pattern. Now, a careful listener might object that these 7 epochs are too neat and they would be right to worry. Real history spills, it overlaps. Brazil does not match Mississippi. Jamaica does not match Alabama. French colonial time does not match British colonial time. African independence movements do not unfold on the same schedule as the US civil rights movement. South African apartheid does not mirror Caribbean labor rebellion in any simple one-to-one way. Any 7-epoch model risks compressing all of this diversity into an elegant line. So why use the model at all? Because elegance is not the only thing it offers. It offers visibility. It lets people recognize that what looked like disconnected humiliations may belong to a single long technology of postponement. It helps explain why emancipation without land, voting without safety, education without narrative truth, and integration without wealth repair can still feel like captivity by other means. It explains why one regime's ending so often becomes another regime's administrative beginning. That is what a punishment cycle means in historical terms. Not one static prison, a prison that modernizes. The mathematics deepen this feeling. 7 prophetic years built on 360-day cycles create one kind of symbolic precision. But history itself unfolds in solar years, fiscal years, school years, crop cycles, election cycles, debt cycles, migration cycles, lifespans. Interpreters trying to synchronize the sevenfold punishment with actual historical milestones often move between symbolic time and observed time. That movement is both the strength and weakness of the theory. Its strength is poetic coherence, its weakness is overconfidence. A 360-day prophetic year belongs to a symbolic reading world. It carries its own internal logic. But when a script claims exactness down to the modern calendar, caution is necessary. Is the reader using ancient symbolic time? Solar years, lunar years, regnal years, rounded dates? The answer changes the emotional force of the argument. Yet perhaps exactness is not the deepest point. Perhaps what matters is not whether every milestone lands on the perfect calculated day, but whether the broad historical sequence looks more structured than chance would suggest. And here the theory grows rhetorically potent. Because when one stands back, the pattern really is unnerving. A vast coerced migration, generations of legalized bondage, centuries of colonial management, abolition without restoration, segregation after emancipation, independence without full economic sovereignty, representation without equal protection, archival silence followed by sudden memory work. You do not need prophecy to see design in the social systems, but prophecy gives that design moral altitude. It says the sequence is not merely structural, it is chastening. And that is why so many people cling to the framework, even when historians object. Because random cruelty wounds the body. Structured cruelty wounds the imagination. But if the structure can be named, then perhaps it can also end. That is the hope hidden inside the fear. Not that 7 epochs make suffering holy. They do not. But that if history had chambers, perhaps history also has a final chamber. And that possibility is what makes the present feel electric. Whenever a theory claims that history has been measured, one question returns with almost mathematical impatience. Measured how? By whose calendar? By what year? By what conversion? By what beginning? By what end? This is where the 7 times framework becomes both most vulnerable and most fascinating, because the very thing that gives it emotional force, the number's precision, is also what forces interpreters into difficult chronological terrain. A prophetic year of 360 days is not the same as a modern solar year. Lunar reckoning complicates matters further. Regnal chronologies in the ancient Near East do not always align cleanly with modern historical dating systems. Biblical texts themselves move in literary, covenantal, and symbolic registers that do not behave like a spreadsheet. So when someone says, with confidence, that the punishment began in one precise ancient year and ends in one precise modern year, they are already standing on multiple interpretive bridges at once. Some of those bridges are sturdy, some are improvised. This does not mean the whole framework collapses, but it does mean we must resist the seduction of easy exactitude. There is something comforting about countdowns. They spare us ambiguity. They let us imagine that if we can only solve the arithmetic, history will finally confess its meaning. Yet real historical suffering rarely behaves that cleanly. Dates matter, but dates must be held inside processes. That is why the lunar and solar question is so revealing. The old prophetic formula often assumes symbolic years of 360 days, a convention that works inside certain apocalyptic systems because it generates meaningful numerical structures. But when those symbolic structures are laid over the Black Diaspora experience, interpreters are forced to decide whether they are reading the number as sacred pattern or as literal clock. If it is sacred pattern, then exact modern date setting should remain humble. If it is literal clock, then every disputed starting point becomes a crisis. And there are many disputed starting points. Was the fall that launches the cycle Assyrian pressure on the northern kingdom, Babylonian humiliation in the south, a later subjugation, a theological abstraction rather than one historical event, and how direct must the line be from that ancient moment to the Atlantic dispersal? Can one leap across centuries in a single prophetic arc without flattening intervening histories? These are not hostile questions. They are necessary ones. Because when a chronology becomes forbidden, hidden, or electrifying in public discourse, people can start to confuse intensity of feeling with strength of evidence. The two are not the same. Still, the desire for exactness tells us something important about the diaspora experience itself. People long for the punishment to have edges. A beginning means the suffering was not always there. An ending means the suffering will not always be here. This is why symbolic calendars become spiritually attractive to populations who have lived through centuries of postponement. The number 2520 does not only measure time, it offers containment. It tells the wounded that even if the discipline is beyond one lifetime, it is not beyond number. Number is mercy when chaos has been too large. Number says the suffering can be counted. Counted suffering can one day be closed. Uncounted suffering feels endless, and endlessness is one of oppression's most intimate weapons. This is also where bad luck gives way to chronology. If you interpret the Black historical experience only through fragmented episodes, one trade route here, one colonial law there, one lynching regime here, one debt system there, one underfunded neighborhood there, you may begin to see misfortune without structure. But if you map those events through a long count, however contested, the emotional logic changes. The question shifts from why so many unfortunate things happened to why so many connected things happened in sequence. Sequence can transform memory. It can turn embarrassment into analysis. It can turn inherited shame into historical recognition. It can turn the private feeling that something has been wrong for a very long time into a public argument about pattern dispossession. This is one reason chronology is surfacing in 2026 with such force. Not because the whole world suddenly believes one prophetic system, but because we are living in an era obsessed with timelines, datasets, record recovery, DNA tracing, digitized archives, mapping tools, and pattern recognition. The contemporary mind is more comfortable than ever seeing history as layered data. When that technological habit meets older prophetic habits, a new hybrid consciousness appears. People start running the numbers, not only in churches, on forums, in podcasts, in family groups, in classrooms, across video essays, across digital collections where ancestors stop being anonymous and begin, one record at a time, to return. This matters because the archive itself has changed. Previous generations often knew the horror in broad terms, but lacked tools to see its full pattern. Now databases hold tens of thousands of voyages. Museums preserve family Bible records, pension files, obituaries, private photographs, military papers, church rolls, oral histories, and local records once inaccessible to most descendants. That does not prove the 520-year theory. But it does mean the modern Black historical imagination is living inside an unprecedented recovery of sequence, and sequence is exactly what prophetic chronologies trade in. So the theory feels less lonely now than it might have 50 years ago. It has entered a world already trained to think in patterns. At the same time, we should not underestimate how easily pattern seeking can become overreach. Humans are remarkably talented at connecting points, sometimes wisely, sometimes desperately. A powerful script must acknowledge this temptation, or it loses credibility. Otherwise, the audience senses that the narration is trying to hypnotize them rather than guide them. So let us say it plainly. There is no universally accepted mathematical proof that the Black Diaspora experience is the direct fulfillment of a 520-year biblical countdown. There are interpretive traditions, date proposals, symbolic correspondences, typological arguments, and theological claims. There is also undeniable history, forced migration, slavery, colonial domination, identity erasure, segregation, economic extraction, cultural fragmentation, and now a mounting wave of recovery. The strength of the script lies in bringing these realities into one frame without pretending the frame is uncontested. Because uncontested things rarely need decoding, forbidden chronologies do. This is what makes the theory rhetorically potent. It offers a structure large enough to hold ancient text, Atlantic catastrophe, and modern awakening at once. It tells the listener that history may have had a hidden spine all along, not visible at the level of annual politics, not obvious inside one family's pain, but visible across generations, if one has the patience to hold theology and history in the same trembling hand. The trembling matters. A script like this should not sound smug. It should sound careful, because the subject deserves care. When people speak about the end of a curse, the conclusion of a cycle, or the lifting of a veil, they are not always speaking from academic distance. Sometimes they are speaking from generational exhaustion, from the sense that one's people have been stuck too long in systems designed to delay restoration, from the instinct that something old is ending even if the newspapers have not yet found the proper language for it. That instinct can be manipulated. It can also be meaningful. The job of the narration is not to sneer at it or surrender to it blindly. The job is to examine it. If solar and lunar calculations never fully settle the question, perhaps that too is part of the point. If we call it punishment, the framework may be more useful as a symbolic chronology than as a promise of perfect timestamps. It may instead be one of those historical conditions where symbolic precision and social precision overlap without becoming identical. The exact year becomes less important than the threshold mood generated around it, and threshold moods matter because they change behavior. People research more, they compare more, they reject inherited labels more quickly, they look again at family silence. They ask new questions about religion, empire, and race. They stop calling certain patterns accidental. That is already a shift, and a shift, once collective enough, can have consequences even before any prophecy is proved. In that sense, the lunar and solar debate may hide a deeper truth. The real argument is not over astronomy, it is over legitimacy. Who has the authority to narrate Black historical time? Imperial archives, national mythologies, secular academia alone, prophetic communities, family memory, digital descendants assembling fragments across continents, forbidden chronology names that contest. It says the timeline itself has been colonized, and perhaps the first sign of the cycle's weakening is that more and more people no longer accept the conqueror's calendar as the only way to tell the story. If a long cycle is ending, what would that ending look like? Probably not fireworks, probably not one headline, probably not a voice from heaven interrupting the news. Historical cycles, especially traumatic ones, do not conclude with cinematic neatness. They thin, they loosen. Their old explanations stop working. Their symbols lose authority. Their victims begin to describe themselves differently. Their archives start yielding names. Their silences become harder to maintain. Their contradictions get louder. The people most shaped by the old order start recognizing patterns faster than the institutions built by that order can adapt. By that interpretive standard, 2026 can feel unusual, not because every data point proves a prophecy, because too many separate developments are moving in the same direction. Start with memory. Across parts of the Black Diaspora, memory work has become increasingly visible. Museums, local historical societies, family history centers, digital humanities projects, ship databases, DNA services, church archives, oral history initiatives, and transnational research communities are changing what descendants can know about themselves. Records once buried in courthouse basements or elite collections are increasingly searchable. Pension applications, funeral programs, family Bible entries, military service documents, plantation ledgers, newspaper notices, port records, and photographs are being gathered and interpreted in new ways. This matters more than it may first appear. A people cut off from sequence are easier to manage. A people recovering sequence become harder to narrate from above. That is because archives do not only return facts, they return relationship. A surname stops being random. A county stops being abstract. A migration path stops being mythic and becomes traceable. An ancestor stops being a generalized victim and becomes a person with service, marriage, land, injury, movement, children, and witnesses. This is one way a veil lifts, not through spectacle, but through record density. The second symptom is comparative consciousness. For much of the 20th century, many Black communities knew their local struggles intensely, while the full transnational pattern remained harder to visualize. Today, a young person can watch a lecture on colonial Kenya, read about Haitian debt, study the Middle Passage, compare South African apartheid to Jim Crow, trace British rule in the Caribbean, and hear a discussion of anti-Blackness in Europe or Latin America in the same week. Digital life has many degradations, but it has also radically compressed comparative time. The result is startling. scattered experiences begin to rhyme. People notice that the language of development often followed plunder, that schooling often followed cultural displacement, that policing often followed labor discipline, that integration without repair often preserved hierarchy beneath a new tone, that freedom, in many regions, arrived under debt, that religion, in many cases, carried both comfort and containment. Once these comparisons become ordinary, official narratives begin to feel thin. This is one reason traditional historical storytelling is struggling. The old national frame, American history here, Caribbean history there, African history there, colonial history there, cannot fully contain the scale of the pattern people are now seeing. Diaspora awareness is widening faster than the categories designed to manage it. Third, there is the shift in public language around anti-blackness and black value. The rise of international mobilizations for black lives in recent years did not create black self-awareness from nothing, but it did expand the public legitimacy of naming anti-black violence as systemic rather than isolated. Once a people are allowed to speak structurally, chronology follows naturally. If violence is systemic, then the next question is how long the system has been running and by what stages. That movement from incident to system is one of the major psychological shifts of our time. It changes the scale of thought, and large-scale thought is exactly what forbidden chronologies invite. Fourth, there is exhaustion with the language of accidental disparity. For decades, many public institutions have explained black disadvantage through partial terms: bad neighborhoods, poor schools, family instability, underinvestment, crime, weak policy design, lack of access, market failure. Some of those terms describe real features of the problem. None of them taken alone explains the recurrence. More and more people sense that the repetition is too dense to be incidental, too consistent across borders, even where legal regimes differ, too adaptive, too capable of surviving reform. When reform does not dissolve pattern, people start suspecting time. Not only bad policy, time, a long design, a sequence older than the latest debate. That suspicion is one of the emotional engines of 2026. Fifth, there is the psychological shift inside the diaspora itself. This is harder to quantify and therefore easier to dismiss, but it may be the most important indicator of all. More people are rejecting inherited definitions of black identity that begin and end with injury. More people are asking not only how we survived slavery and segregation, but what intellectual, spiritual, economic, and civilizational continuities persisted beneath them. More people are suspicious of narratives that treat black history as a supplement to white modernity, rather than a central axis in the making of the modern world. This shift matters because punishment depends partly on self-description. If a people accept the conqueror's summary of them, the cycle deepens. If they begin naming themselves differently, the cycle weakens. That does not mean suffering ends overnight. It means the psychology of inevitability starts to fracture, and inevitability is the deepest layer of bondage. Think about the difference between oppression and permanent oppression. Oppression says you are constrained. Permanent oppression says constraint is the nature of things. Never thing consistent. The first can be fought, the second must first be unlearned. What many people are sensing in 2026 is that the unlearning has accelerated, not uniformly, not perfectly, not without backlash, but accelerated. People are less willing to confuse underrepresentation with incapacity, less willing to confuse poverty with inferiority, less willing to confuse interrupted records with absent history, less willing to let state violence appear as isolated malfunction, less willing to inherit narratives that begin the black story at the point of European capture. That last change is especially significant. If a people begin telling their story from kingdoms, cities, lineages, intellectual traditions, spiritual systems, resistance networks, and long genealogies, rather than from enslavement alone, then the curse, whether one sees it theologically or metaphorically, already starts to lose its totalizing power. Why? Because the punishment depended on historical compression. It depended on making a vast people feel recent, derivative, and contextless. Restoration begins when time opens backward again. That is what archival recovery, Pan-African comparison, and diaspora self-study are doing. They are reopening backward time, and once backward time opens, forward time changes too. This brings us to the failure of traditional narratives. Conventional history often knows how to explain institutions, but not awakenings. It can tell you when laws changed. It can tell you commodity flows, migration totals, court decisions, and parliamentary dates. It struggles more with threshold consciousness, the moment when a people begin seeing themselves not as isolated descendants of tragedy, but as participants in a world-scale historical pattern whose interpretive meaning is still unfolding. That is why 2026 can feel underdescribed by mainstream discourse. The signs are present, but the old vocabulary is tired. Economic inequality, polarization, identity politics, cultural backlash. These terms capture fragments. They do not capture the sensation that something buried is surfacing simultaneously in religion, politics, ancestry, digital culture, academic research, artistic production, and intergenerational conversation. In that environment, a phrase like, "the veil is lifting," suddenly feels less mystical than diagnostic. The veil is whatever kept the pattern from appearing as pattern. The veil is historical fragmentation. The veil is conquered naming. The veil is the idea that each insult is separate from the systems before it. The veil is the learned inability to connect shipping records to school funding, plantation wealth to urban redlining, colonial borders to present instability, or biblical exile language to modern experiences of inheritance loss. When the veil lifts, none of these connections have to be perfect to become powerful. They only have to become visible, and visibility itself alters a people's future, not immediately in the market, not immediately in the courts, not immediately in statecraft, but immediately in imagination. And imagination is where every long historical reversal begins. The punishment, if this framework is right, did not only attack black bodies, it attacked temporal confidence. It taught generations to live inside delay, to expect postponement, to distrust restoration unless it came in diluted form, to negotiate constantly with reduced horizons. If 2026 signifies anything, perhaps it signifies a breach in that habit, a widening sense that restoration must be thought on a larger scale, larger than inclusion, larger than symbolic representation, larger than diversity language, larger than one nation's civil rights archive. What people are groping toward, often without a stable phrase for it, is civilizational self-awareness. And when civilizational self-awareness begins to rise inside a people long trained to think of themselves in fragments, every institution built on those fragments starts to shake a little. That shaking is not the end of the cycle, but it may be the sound the cycle makes when it begins to loosen. One of the clearest signs that a cycle is ending is that the explanations that sustained it stop feeling adequate. They still function, they still get taught, they still appear in documentaries, textbooks, op-eds, and policy reports. But they no longer satisfy the people who have had to live inside the consequences. This is where we are now. Official narratives of Black history are not uniformly false. Many contain hard-won truths. They tell us about slavery, Reconstruction, migration, civil rights, decolonization, labor struggle, urbanization, music, literature, voting rights, anti-colonial movements, and state violence. These histories matter. They were fought for. They should not be discarded lightly. But a narrative can contain truths and still fail to explain the whole weather. That is the problem. What many inherited histories cannot adequately explain is recurrence. Why the injury keeps returning under new administration. Why reform so often changes language more than outcomes. Why memory remains fragmented even after archives open. Why gains arrive beside backlash with such regularity. Why anti-blackness travels so easily across nations with different constitutions, denominations, and party systems. Why economic structures built on extraction seem endlessly capable of adapting after moral discredit. Official narratives often answer these questions in pieces: racism, capitalism, imperialism, national politics, color prejudice, institutional inertia. Each is true, each is insufficient alone. The listener, especially the listener shaped by diaspora experience, feels this insufficiency before they can always articulate it. They sense that the history they were taught describes events but not sequence, or describes sequence without moral scale, or describes moral scale without spiritual meaning. The result is an explanatory vacuum. Forbidden chronology enters that vacuum. It says the reason the narrative feels incomplete is that the story has been told from the surface downward rather than from the pattern outward. It suggests that if you only read the public milestones, abolition here, rights legislation there, Independence Day over there, you miss the deeper continuity of punishment and delay. You mistake local reform for civilizational reversal. Now again, we must be careful. Not every feeling of incompleteness justifies a prophetic reconstruction. Sometimes narratives feel incomplete because all narratives are partial, sometimes because historians are working against damaged archives, sometimes because public education simplifies by necessity, sometimes because no single story can carry every border of the diaspora at once. Still, partiality alone does not explain why so many people are turning toward deeper pattern explanations at the same historical moment. That convergence deserves respect. Consider what traditional progress narratives ask Black communities to believe. They ask them to see history as painful but steadily improving. Slavery ended, segregation fell, colonies became nations, representation increased, Black culture globalized. Doors opened, opportunities widened. All of that is true in some measure, yet millions still live with the experiential knowledge that the structure keeps finding new forms. Wealth remains asymmetrical. Housing remains segregated by legacy, if not always by explicit law. School quality tracks old geographies. Policing patterns remain racialized. Medical inequities persist. The afterlife of extraction shapes national budgets, public memory, and social trust. So the question returns: if progress is real, why does the pattern still feel intact? One answer is that institutions change slower than laws. Another is that economies remember what courts deny. Another is that racial hierarchy is embedded in global development itself. All good answers. But for many, they still do not touch the eerie scale of repetition. That is where the language of a hidden chronology becomes so alluring. It does not merely describe oppression. It reorders it into epochs with internal coherence. It makes delay itself intelligible. And delay is the heart of the matter. The Black diaspora has so often existed inside delayed arrival, delayed recognition, delayed justice, delayed compensation, delayed naming, delayed access to the archive, delayed legitimacy within the academy, delayed international solidarity, delayed ownership, delayed sovereignty. In an ordinary political framework, these are policy failures and structural inequities. Inside a chronology framework, they become evidence that the time of restoration had not yet fully turned, that reading may not satisfy secular historians, but it can feel viscerally persuasive to those living under the pressure of repeated postponement. The failure of official narratives is also visible in how they handle identity. Traditional histories often begin the Black story at the point it becomes legible to Europe or the modern state. The clock starts when the empire starts recording. Before that, the story is treated as prologue, Africa as background, not center. Kingdoms, philosophies, regional systems of knowledge, long commercial networks, theological worlds, and artistic traditions are acknowledged, if at all, in preface form. Then the main narrative begins with captivity. This narrative structure does enormous damage. It teaches descendants to imagine themselves as entering history through violation. It makes survival the first identity. It compresses civilizational time into trauma time. And once trauma time dominates, the people burdened by it begin seeking alternative calendars almost inevitably. They want a story in which the beginning is older than the wound, a story in which the wound itself, however devastating, belongs to a longer timeline rather than defining the whole horizon. This is why the return of chronology is also the return of depth. Not depth as mystique, depth as refusal to begin where the oppressor's records begin. To say that official narratives are failing, then, is not to say all historians are dishonest. It is to say the inherited structure of public explanation is too narrow for what many people are now seeing. The Black diaspora is not merely a demographic category or a civil rights constituency. It is a transgenerational peoplehood shaped by forced movement, recurring governance, memory fracture, spiritual reinterpretation, and re-emerging historical scale. Once you see it that way, the old categories start to crack. Minority history no longer sounds sufficient. National inclusion no longer sounds sufficient. Multicultural recognition no longer sounds sufficient. Because the issue is no longer just participation in existing systems. It is whether the entire story of time has been arranged to minimize what Black history actually is. This is why the rise of global diaspora self-awareness feels so sudden to some observers. It is not sudden, it is cumulative. What looks like overnight awakening is usually the moment when many buried streams join at the surface: church study, family research, academic work, music, internet communities, museum archives, social movement language, anti-colonial critique, reparations debate, and the ordinary private fatigue of people who know that the old explanations no longer explain enough. The failure of official narratives is therefore not merely intellectual, it is existential. People cannot inhabit a story forever if the story keeps misdescribing the shape of their pain. Eventually they will write another one, and when they do, the establishment often panics. It calls the new story divisive, anachronistic, conspiratorial, essentialist, dangerous. Sometimes those criticisms are partly fair. New narratives can overreach, they can mythologize, they can collapse complexity into sweeping claims, but the establishment's panic usually reveals something else as well. It is alarmed that explanatory control is shifting. That alarm should not surprise us. To narrate time is to govern meaning. If the conqueror's story says the Black past is a chain of unfortunate episodes, gradually corrected by liberal progress, then the moral demand placed on the present remains limited: better policy, more inclusion, more patience. If the alternative story says the Black past has been structured by a long cycle of curse-like dispersal, extraction, and deferred restoration, then the moral demand changes radically. The issue is no longer patchwork reform, it is historical reckoning. That is a much more dangerous conversation. Dangerous not because it produces violence, dangerous because it redistributes legitimacy, and legitimacy is what official narratives are built to protect. So when we hear that traditional explanations are failing to account for the sudden rise in diaspora self-awareness, we should understand that failing in a very precise sense. They can still describe institutions, they can still list dates, they can still recount major leaders and turning points. What they are losing is monopoly over interpretation. They are no longer the only available framework for making sense of Black historical time. That, by itself, may be one of the most consequential shifts of this decade. A people changes when it no longer borrows its timeline from those who managed its delay. Every chronology becomes most consequential at the moment it turns from diagnosis to instruction. If a cycle is ending, what then? If the 7 times punishment, whether read literally, symbolically, or as a disciplined metaphor for long Black historical delay, is approaching its final edge, what does restoration actually require? Not sentiment, not online excitement, not one more dramatic claim about hidden truth. What does it demand from a people living in a digitized global economy, still built on many of the inequalities the long cycle helped produce? First, it requires a change in scale. Restoration cannot mean mere inclusion inside the same structures that were shaped by the long punishment. Inclusion matters, voting rights matter, legal protection matters, access matters. But if the story has been one of civilizational diminishment, then restoration must be civilizational in scope as well. That means the future cannot be imagined only in terms of representation within existing elites. It must include memory, institutions, capital, education, land, technological capacity, transnational cooperation, and narrative sovereignty. Narrative sovereignty may sound abstract. It is not. A people without control over its own timeline will eventually lose control over its priorities. So the first actionable insight is this: reclaim chronology at the level of family, local archive, and public teaching. Build timelines that begin before catastrophe. Put ancestors back into sequence. Record oral histories before they vanish. Learn the migrations within your own family. Study the colonial and post-colonial transitions that shaped your country, city, parish, county, or district. The point is not antiquarian pride. The point is psychological restoration. Once people can place themselves in time, they stop mistaking inherited interruption for personal deficiency. Second, restoration requires economic literacy sharpened by historical memory. The modern world did not simply encounter Black labor. It was transformed by its extraction. Plantation profits, commodity cycles, shipping systems, land conversion, and imperial finance all fed the making of capitalism as we know it. If that is true, then a post-520-year mindset cannot be satisfied with symbolic empowerment alone. It must ask where value is created, who owns platforms, who controls logistics, who captures data, who shapes currency flows, who benefits from precarious labor, and how anti-black inequality mutates inside digital markets. This means economic restoration must be contemporary, not nostalgic. The future will not be won merely by recovering old wounds. It will be won by understanding code, infrastructure, finance, cooperative ownership, supply chains, intellectual property, media distribution, and demographic leverage. The curse, if we use that language, moved through material systems. So must restoration. Third, the post-cycle landscape demands institutional seriousness. A great danger in awakening moments is romantic excess. People sense the veil lifting and imagine that recognition itself is freedom. It is not. Recognition without institution becomes mood. Mood rises fast and disperses fast. If this moment is really a threshold, then it must be anchored in schools, archives, investment circles, publishing houses, legal organizations, research networks, health initiatives, agricultural strategy, housing models, community technology hubs, and transnational partnerships. One of the reasons the long punishment felt endless is that generations were forced to survive under institutions designed by others. Survival is heroic. It is not the same as sovereignty. Sovereignty requires build capacity. Fourth, restoration requires psychological revision. A people shaped by centuries of delay often inherit emotional habits suited to scarcity, improvisation without long planning, vigilance without rest, achievement tied to constant overperformance, distrust of institutions mixed with dependence on them, and a tendency to treat fragmentation as normal. These habits are understandable. They were adaptive under punishment. But what preserves life in captivity does not always prepare life in restoration. So the post-timeline question becomes intimate. Can families imagine a future longer than immediate defense? Can communities teach children that they come from interrupted greatness rather than from deficiency? Can black excellence be redefined beyond extraction into white or imperial institutions? Can rest, land, craft, study, and intergenerational transfer be treated not as luxuries, but as restoration practices? These are not secondary matters. They are the psychological infrastructure of a people leaving long discipline. Fifth, the new landscape demands transnational thinking. The Black Diaspora was produced transnationally. The systems that managed it, slavery, colonial administration, trade law, missionary culture, debt, migration control, media stereotype, resource extraction, were never confined to one nation. Yet black political strategy has often been forced into national silos. That made sense under immediate legal struggle. But a post-520-year framework urges something wider: cooperation among African, Caribbean, African American, Latin American, European diaspora, and other black communities around archival projects, educational exchange, technology, health, climate adaptation, resource governance, shipping, arts, and political theory. If the punishment was globalized, restoration cannot remain parochial. Sixth, the future requires theological and philosophical maturity. The language of punishment can easily become self-destructive if left unrefined. People can begin blaming the wounded for the wound. They can read every hardship as deserved. They can attach divine inevitability to present inequality and quietly reproduce despair. That is a misuse of the framework. A more mature reading would say, if there was discipline, its point cannot have been permanent degradation. Biblical punishment language, where it appears, is always shadowed by the possibility of repentance, remembrance, restoration, and return. In that sense, the chronology matters not because it glorifies suffering, but because it implies suffering is not the final word. That theological distinction is decisive. A curse with no end is nihilism. A discipline with an end is severe, but not meaningless. Still, even that formulation must be held gently, especially when speaking to communities already carrying intergenerational trauma. No one needs a script that sounds as though it is scolding the enslaved or the colonized for not escaping faster. Restoration talk must dignify survival before it demands transformation. Seventh, restoration in a digitized economy requires command of information ecologies. The future belongs, in large part, to whoever can store, sort, tell, and monetize data. For centuries, black peoples were recorded by others. in ledgers, cargo lists, plantation books, census categories, policing files, anthropological distortions, school reports, and media caricatures. To move beyond the old timeline, descendants must become producers and custodians of data rather than raw material within it. That means digital literacy, archival preservation, AI fluency, platform ownership, media discipline, cybersecurity, and the ethical management of community knowledge. In plain language, do not let the new empire be informational while remaining politically invisible. Eighth, a restored future requires intergenerational grammar. Too many communities shaped by long punishment are forced into present tense. Elders carry memory but lack institutional support. Youth inherit crisis but not sequence. Middle generations mediate urgency without enough continuity. One actionable response is simple and radical. Build regular practices in which history, money, health, movement, spirituality, and local knowledge are discussed across generations. The cycle weakens when time is shared. It strengthens when every generation must rediscover the wound alone. Ninth, restoration demands a different relationship to work. Under slavery and colonialism, black labor built wealth it did not control. Under segregation and many forms of modern inequality, black labor often remained undervalued even when socially indispensable. In a post-cycle frame, the question becomes not only how to work harder, but how to convert labor into owned continuity. Cooperative enterprise, land trusts, educational endowments, community investment, and strategic professional networks matter because they transform labor from survival expenditure into historical accumulation. That is how people exit long postponement, not by motivation alone, by structures that allow effort to remain with those who generate it. 10th, a people leaving a forbidden timeline must learn to distinguish revelation from performance. Our era rewards spectacle. A dramatic theory spreads faster than a patient institution. A prophetic countdown travels faster than a pension archive. A viral speech travels faster than a land trust. But sustainable restoration almost always looks less glamorous than awakening. It is study, ledgers, legal strategy, school building, health practice, historical editing, trade literacy, emotional repair, and disciplined cooperation. If the cycle is truly ending, then one test of that ending will be whether people can move from charged recognition to durable construction. A people cannot live forever at the level of unveiling. Eventually the veil is off, and the work begins. That sentence may be the most sobering one in the whole script, because hidden chronologies are exciting. Institutional repair is repetitive, but repetition, in the service of life rather than bondage, is precisely what restoration looks like. Finally, the future beyond the forbidden timeline requires mercy toward those still waking up. Not everyone arrives at historical consciousness in the same season. Some remain attached to official narratives because those narratives offered their first stability. Some are wary of prophetic frameworks because they have seen them abused. Some lean fully into theology. Some reject theology and still feel the pattern. Some want numbers. Some want policy. A mature, restored community will need room for all these registers as long as they move toward dignity rather than fragmentation. If the 7 times are ending, then the measure of the ending will not be that everyone agrees on the arithmetic. It will be that more people refuse the old diminishment. More people can place themselves in a longer arc. More people build as though the future belongs to them. More people stop confusing survival with destiny. And more people understand that the post-curse era, if that is what this is, will not be handed down by history. It will have to be organized. There is one more part of the chronology that cannot be left at the level of institutions, the mind. Because a long punishment does not only move through ships, fields, statutes, and budgets, it moves through expectation, through what feels normal, through what people dare to hope for, prepare for, and teach to their children. If the Black Diaspora has endured anything like a 7-fold sequence of historical discipline, then one of its deepest signatures would be internal exile, the condition of living physically somewhere while being psychologically estranged from one's own scale, inheritance, and possibility. Internal exile is not self-hatred, though it can include that. It is suppler. It is what happens when a people are present everywhere in the making of the modern world and yet are taught to read themselves as peripheral to it. It is what happens when survival knowledge multiplies, but civilizational memory shrinks. It is what happens when gifted children inherit brilliance alongside an atmosphere of delay. It is what happens when public life allows black performance more easily than black authorship of time. That is the veil in one of its deepest meanings, not ignorance, disproportion, living below one's historical scale. Many black communities have experienced versions of this condition, to be essential yet secondary, hyper-visible in labor, culture, athletic spectacle, electoral calculation, and moral rhetoric, while still being under-acknowledged as a world-making people with their own long strategic timeline. Myanmar. This is why self-awareness can feel so sudden when it comes. What is actually happening is that scale is being restored to consciousness. Scale changes emotion. A person who thinks their people entered history as victims will dream one way. A person who understands their people as carriers of interrupted civilizations, transnational memory, and still unfinished institutions will dream another. The end of internal exile begins in that difference. This is why the language of the veil lifting is not merely poetic. It names a shift in proportion. The problems are still real, the disparities still bite, the political obstacles remain formidable, but the interpretive field changes. Instead of reading every present difficulty as evidence of personal or communal inadequacy, people begin to locate themselves inside a larger temporal struggle. That move can be psychologically stabilizing even before material conditions improve, because it interrupts the oldest trick of long oppression, making structural diminishment feel like natural limit. Natural limit is one of history's cruelest illusions. It says this is simply how things are. This is just what your people do. This is just what your neighborhoods become. This is just what your institutions can manage. This is just how power works. A long punishment cycle would depend on those sentences being believed, not by everyone equally, but enough. Enough to make delay appear reasonable, enough to make compromised futures look practical, enough to make intergenerational ambition feel risky or unrealistic. If the cycle is ending, then what should we expect to see psychologically? First, intensified conflict over self-definition. Whenever a people move from imposed identity towards self-authored identity, the transition is noisy. Some will run toward prophetic language, some toward academic frameworks, some toward nationalism, some toward cosmopolitanism, some toward spiritual return, some toward economic strategy, some toward art, some toward local service. The diversity can look chaotic. In fact, it may be one of the clearest signs that the mind is no longer obeying a single imposed script. Second, we would expect memory hunger. People suddenly want the names, the maps, the land records, the ship manifests, the military units, the church rolls, the grandmother's story nobody wrote down, the family Bible, the region in Africa, the county in South Carolina, the plantation ledger, the migration route north, the school founded after emancipation, the village altered by colonial rule. This hunger is not a trend. It is a symptom of temporal restoration. The mind is reaching to rebuild the corridors that punishment collapsed. Third, we would expect discomfort with narratives of pure assimilation. A people waking from long internal exile may no longer be satisfied with success defined solely as proximity to dominant institutions. Individual achievement continues to matter, of course, but it begins to feel insufficient if it does not contribute to wider restoration. Representation without redistribution, visibility without archive, access without ownership, inclusion without self-determined curriculum. These start to feel less like victory and more like managed containment. Fourth, we would expect spiritual recomposition. The Black Diaspora has always negotiated complex religious inheritances, African continuities, forced Christianity, liberative Christianity, syncretic traditions, secular critique, prophetic reinterpretation, Muslim currents, nationalist theologies, and more. If the cycle is shifting, these inheritances do not disappear, they intensify. People ask harder questions about what religion preserved, what it distorted, what it soothed, and what it silenced. Some move toward old texts with new urgency, some away from them. Some reclaim ancestral streams. Some attempt synthesis. The common feature is not agreement, it is refusal to remain passive inside inherited frameworks. That refusal is itself a milestone, because passive inheritance is one of punishment's favored tools. Fifth, we would expect new sensitivity to repetition. Once the veil thins, people start noticing the same pattern in multiple domains. schooling that manages rather than cultivates, media that celebrates expression while commodifying pain, political campaigns that harvest turnout without restructuring life, development language that masks extraction, criminal justice systems that rename social abandonment as public safety. A people leaving internal exile become harder to placate because they recognize mutation faster. They see the old thing in the new thing. And this is where backlash intensifies. Every system built on delayed recognition prefers its subjects lucid enough to survive, but not lucid enough to reorganize. When clarity deepens, the response is often ridicule, fragmentation, overexposure to noise, or the flooding of the public space with competing caricatures. And some descendants seeking chronology are dismissed as fanatics. Others are absorbed into harmless branding. Still others are courted as influencers rather than listened to as thinkers. The system adapts because systems always adapt, but adaptation is not omnipotence. A changing mind is a serious threat, not because thought alone is enough, because thought reorders what people will tolerate. There is also a personal cost to the end of internal exile. People often imagine awakening as exhilarating, and sometimes it is, but it can also be disorienting. If the story that structured your world no longer persuades you, then you must rebuild not only your beliefs but your habits of attention. Old measures of success may feel too small. Old loyalties may grow complicated. Family members may not agree. Spiritual communities may divide. The new horizon can be liberating and lonely at once. That loneliness should not be underestimated, especially for people first awakening to the long chronology of black dispossession in settings where official narratives still dominate public respectability. This is why community matters so much in threshold periods. The veil does not lift evenly. Some people are already thinking transgenerationally. Others are just beginning to sense that something in the usual story is false. One of the responsibilities of those further along is not to weaponize their insight against those still waking, but to create language that invites rather than humiliates, punishment fragments. Restoration must not imitate it. Here the script reaches an especially delicate point. If one overstates the chronology, the audience may hear manipulation. If one understates it, the emotional truth can evaporate. The balance is to show that whether or not one accepts every prophetic claim, internal exile is real and its weakening is visible. A people are re-entering their own time. They are beginning to hear the interval between ancient loss, Atlantic rupture, modern control, and future possibility as one conversation rather than four disconnected courses. That conversation changes posture. The back straightens. The questions deepen. The appetite for shallow validation decreases. The willingness to build for people not yet born increases. That last change may be the most important of all. Punishment is often short-term by design. It forces the oppressed into immediate survival. Restoration reintroduces long planning. A community that believes the veil is lifting will begin to think in generations, not trending cycles. It will ask different questions about land, health, curriculum, faith, capital, family structure, migration, and transnational alliance. It will begin to behave as though the future is not merely something to endure, but something to shape. That is the true end of internal exile. Not simply feeling proud, feeling responsible for time. And once a people feel responsible for time, the old chronology, even if disputed in form, has already achieved one of its deepest functions. It has moved the mind from captivity to stewardship. There is a final danger in all this talk of cycles. A people can become so fascinated with the architecture of their suffering that they forget suffering is not the only thing history produces. They can become excellent readers of bondage and poor builders of freedom. They can decode the curse and still live emotionally obedient to it. That is why every serious script about a forbidden chronology must eventually confront a hard question. How do you stop repeating the cycle after you finally recognize it? Recognition alone is not enough, because every long punishment leaves behind habits that can recreate miniatures of the original structure inside the community itself. Suspicion, fragmentation, short planning, leadership cults, distrust of institution building, romantic attraction to symbolism without infrastructure, a tendency to confuse intensity with strategy. These are understandable inheritances, but if they are not addressed, A people can exit formal bondage and still remain rhythmically captive to the emotional afterlife of bondage. This is why restoration must be more than revelation. It must become sovereignty. And sovereignty here should not be reduced to a slogan or a passport question. It means the capacity of a people to define priorities, transmit memory, govern institutions, cultivate health, accumulate protected value, and negotiate with the world from a position deeper than reaction. In practical terms, sovereignty can appear in schools, land, media, research, cooperative finance, artistic ecosystems, local political competence, international alliance, and theological independence. The point is not one form. The point is durable self-determination. Punishment is often repetitive. Sovereignty must become repetitive too. Repetitive schooling, repetitive saving, repetitive study, repetitive care, repetitive institution maintenance, repetitive cross-generational transmission. The long cycle trained repetition in the service of diminishment. Restoration requires repetition in the service of continuity. This is where many awakening movements falter. They mistake emotional intensity for structural change. They think naming the system is the same as outrunning it. It is not. A people can brilliantly critique empire and still lack enough schools, brilliantly decode anti-blackness and still lack capital pathways, brilliantly denounce historical lies and still fail to preserve its own local records. The critique matters. But critique without build leaves future generations eloquent and exposed. And exposure is what the old cycle thrived on. That is why one of the most actionable insights in a post-520-year landscape is boring in the best possible sense: durability. Preserve what you build. Document what you learn. Pass down more than slogans. Make excellence reproducible. Do not let every generation begin at zero emotionally, financially, or historically. The curse, whatever one calls it, gained force by interrupting continuity. Therefore, continuity is one of the strongest forms of resistance. There is also the issue of geographic imagination. The Black Diaspora was trained to think in fragments: neighborhood, island, colony, plantation, parish, county, nation-state. Those scales are real, but they can also shrink possibility. A people serious about restoration will need multiple scales at once: hyperlocal knowledge and global awareness, family history and geopolitical literacy, village archives and continental strategy. One of the reasons the old punishment felt endless is that those scales were often forcibly separated. What happened in one port was hidden from the schoolchild in another. What happened in one colony's treasury was disconnected from the laborer's life in another. What happened in one church archive never reached the descendants who needed it. Reconnection is therefore not sentimental, it is strategic. And strategy matters because the modern world still rewards dispersion when dispersion serves power. Global markets are perfectly happy to circulate black labor, creativity, and consumption while leaving black political coordination weak. Media platforms can amplify expression while fragmenting organization. States can celebrate diversity while resisting structural transfer. The post-cycle challenge is to inhabit global connectivity without becoming newly exploitable through it. That means learning from the past in a very specific way. The Middle Passage was forced globalization. Digital culture is voluntary seeming globalization. Both can disperse identity if entered without strategy. So restoration requires a disciplined digital presence, not only content creation, but archive creation, not only commentary, but pedagogy, not only personal brand, but durable community knowledge. Otherwise, the future becomes another plantation of attention. Yes, that sentence is severe, but it is worth hearing. Extraction always updates itself. If sugar and cotton trained one economic age, data and attention train another. A people that understands the old cycle should be especially alert to the new forms of harvest. There is also a moral danger in restoration discourse that must be named: triumph without tenderness. Once people believe the curse is ending, they may grow impatient with the still fragmented, the still injured, the still confused, the still dependent. They may begin to divide the community into awakened and unawakened, pure remnant and compromised masses, disciplined and disposable, that would only reproduce one of the oldest logics of punishment: sorting the people in order to manage them. Restoration worthy of the name must resist that impulse. It must make room for healing, not just sorting, for learning, not just exposing, for scaffolding, not just testing. Otherwise, the future will carry too much of the old structure in new clothing. This is especially important in conversations about Black identity and biblical destiny. The language can become intoxicating: chosenness, curse, remnant, restoration, exile, return. These are heavy words. They can dignify the wounded. They can also tempt communities into spiritual elitism or contempt for those who do not share the framework. A mature script must therefore keep one hand on moral seriousness and one on humility. Whatever the chronology means, it cannot mean permission to despise the struggling or simplify the unconvinced. If anything, the logic of long punishment should deepen compassion, because no one passes through centuries of fracture without carrying visible and invisible costs. So what does avoiding repetition look like in concrete terms? It looks like teaching children both pride and method. It looks like supporting Black institutions without treating them as exempt from accountability. It looks like building wealth without worshipping wealth. It looks like healing trauma without romanticizing fragility. It looks like recovering pre-captivity history without flattening Africa into myth. It looks like global solidarity without dissolving local obligations. It looks like spiritual seriousness without abandoning evidence. It looks like evidence without mocking the deep religious imagination through which many people survived. In other words, it looks like maturity, and maturity may be the real mark of a people stepping out of a long chronological shadow. Not excitement alone, not outrage alone. The ability to hold grief, evidence, prophecy, economics, and future building in one disciplined frame. This is why understanding the chronology matters even for those who never fully accept the 520-year calculation. Because the framework forces a large question back onto the table. What would it mean to live as though the age of endless postponement were actually ending? Many people do not know how to answer that because postponement trained them too well. To live after postponement means planning farther, saving differently, choosing relationships with more historical consciousness, evaluating institutions by whether they increase collective continuity rather than symbolic access alone, teaching history with more pre-catastrophe depth, making room for grief that has not yet had language, and refusing narratives that ask the next generation to be merely resilient when they should also be free. That is the crucial difference. Resilience is noble. It is not the final goal. The old cycle produced extraordinary resilience because it had to. The new era, if it is beginning, must produce something else: capacity, coordination, continuity, and a level of historical self-respect that no longer treats Black flourishing as surprising. That may be the simplest sign that the punishment is ending. When a people no longer experience their own full humanity as an exception. After all the counting, all the voyages, all the disputed dates, all the prophetic arguments, all the archives, there is one last question we have to ask. What if the deepest truth of the chronology is not that it lets us predict the future, but that it teaches us how to read the past without shrinking it? That may sound modest. It is not, because shrinking is one of the oldest violences done to the Black diaspora. The scale of the experience is continuously miniaturized, reduced to national episodes, reduced to race relations, reduced to one country's pathology, reduced to a problem of inclusion, reduced to a story of suffering with no commensurate account of world-making, memory, intelligence, endurance, or civilizational interruption. The 7 times framework resists that shrinking. Even where it overreaches in the direction of scale. It insists that what happened was not minor, not local, not temporary, not adequately explained by one election, one doctrine, one market trend, or one reform law. It says the catastrophe was long enough, structured enough, and spiritually disorienting enough that ordinary historical language can sound too small. That insistence is part of why the framework keeps returning. People are trying to find a container large enough for the truth, and the truth is large. A people taken through oceans, a people recorded as cargo, a people made to build wealth they did not inherit, a people fractured by sale, renamed by law, described by theology, classified by pseudoscience, segregated by custom, and still expected to explain themselves inside the moral vocabulary of the powers that did all this. If that does not require a larger chronology, what would? Yet scale alone is not wisdom. A large story can still be abused. That is why the last question of the timeline is moral, not merely mathematical. What do we become when we tell the story this way? If the answer is pride without discipline, then the script has failed. If the answer is bitterness without construction, then the script has failed. If the answer is fatalism dressed as prophecy, then the script has failed. If the answer is arrogance toward other black people whose awakenings take different forms, then the script has failed. But if the answer is deeper patience, longer planning, fuller memory, sharper refusal of historical diminishment, greater seriousness about institution building, and a new tenderness toward a people long pushed through delay, then perhaps the chronology has served a meaningful purpose, even for those who remain unsure of its literal precision. This is where the script must end, not in numerical certainty, but in historical sobriety. The sobriety says this: the Black Diaspora has endured a sequence of dispossessions so persistent that many of its descendants no longer believe accidental language is adequate. They are reaching for frameworks broad enough to connect scripture, empire, slavery, segregation, psychology, data, and future building. The 7 times punishment is one such framework. It is controversial. It is not universally accepted. Its arithmetic is debated. Its identity claims are disputed. And still it persists because it names something official histories often understate: the sense of having lived inside a long, structured postponement whose end may finally be approaching. Whether that ending is prophetic, sociological, technological, psychological, or some mixture of all 4, the effects are already visible. People are researching differently, teaching differently, remembering differently, comparing differently, building differently, refusing differently. And perhaps most of all, they are imagining differently. That matters because imagination is where future history is rehearsed. Long punishment distorts imagination toward survival. Ending punishment expands imagination toward stewardship. A people begin to think not only about how to protect themselves from harm, but how to shape value, institutions, trade, memory, and moral language for generations they will never meet. That is not merely a political change, it is a temporal one. It means the people have stepped out of emergency time and are beginning, however unevenly, to inhabit covenantal time again, the time in which actions are measured not only by immediate safety, but by intergenerational consequence. Emergency time is exhausting. Covenantal time is demanding, but it is also larger. It asks more because it assumes a future worth building. This is one of the most hopeful things concealed inside the forbidden chronology. Even its harshest versions imply that the night is not self-sustaining. A count only matters because counts end. A discipline only matters because there is a threshold beyond it. If the threshold is near, or even if the feeling of nearness is simply awakening a scattered people to their own unfinished scale, then the proper response is neither passivity nor hysteria. It is preparation, preparation of memory, preparation of family, preparation of institutions, preparation of economic imagination, preparation of moral seriousness, preparation of a people to stop treating restoration as decorative and start treating it as administrative. That final word matters, administrative, because one of the bitterest truths of the long punishment is that so much black suffering was made durable through administration. Ledgers, codes, maps, ports, property law, school zoning, labor contracts, loan practices, colonial ordinances, bureaucratic categories, police reports, statistical erasure. If the cycle is ending, restoration too must become administrative, recorded, budgeted, staffed, taught, archived, defended, transmitted. Otherwise it remains only emotion, and emotion, however righteous, cannot outlast a system by itself. Perhaps that is the truest meaning of learning the chronology. Not that we can now predict every date, but that we can no longer afford a shallow account of what has happened to us. We can no longer afford histories that begin where our captors began counting. We can no longer afford futures planned as though anti-black delay were incidental. We can no longer afford a politics that treats symbolism as sufficient compensation for centuries of extracted life. The timeline, forbidden or not, has already done its work if it has made that clear. Still, there is one more reversal worth holding on to. A punishment cycle can teach a people what was done to them. It cannot by itself tell them who they are beyond what was done. That answer must come from somewhere deeper, from family and study, from land and liturgy, from archive and invention, from trade and care, from cities and songs, from the long record of black thought that survived every attempt to reduce black life to labor or spectacle. This is why the post-520 horizon, if such a horizon is real, cannot be built only on negation. Not only we are no longer under the curse, not only we have decoded the pattern, it must say positively what kind of civilization we intend to become when we are no longer organizing ourselves around surviving the old one. That is the last question of the timeline. Not when did the punishment start, not even when does it end. Who are we when it no longer gets to define our imagination? The answer to that cannot be delivered by arithmetic. It has to be lived, and maybe that is why 2026 feels so charged. Not because a number solved history, because history is pressing a people to become equal to a wider measure of themselves. Some will answer that call through theology, some through scholarship, some through business, some through archives, some through family repair, some through political work, some through art, some through all of them together. What matters is not uniform method. What matters is that the old diminishment no longer feels inevitable. Once inevitability cracks, time opens. And when time opens, the future becomes less a sentence than a field. That field will still contain struggle. Cycles do not end in perfection, but they can end in a new distribution of meaning. The people once narrated as aftermath begin to narrate themselves as origin and future. The community once expected to merely absorb history begins to assign history tasks of its own. The descendants of dispersal begin to speak in the language of restoration, not as fantasy, but as horizon. If that is where we are, then the chronology has not merely been decoded. It has become a demand that the next era not be lived as if the old era taught us nothing, a demand that memory become capacity, a demand that awakening become institution, a demand that pain become more than identity, a demand that the scattered become strategic, a demand that the future stop arriving in fragments. And perhaps, after so many centuries of delay, that is the most radical shift of all. Not that the people finally know the number, but that they no longer plan as though they belong to someone else's clock. That is where the forbidden chronology finally leads. Not to spectacle, to responsibility, not to abstraction, to sequence, not to fear, to stewardship. And if stewardship is rising now across the Black Diaspora, unevenly, imperfectly, but unmistakably, then maybe the truest sign of the cycle's ending is not outside us. Maybe it is the return of a people to their own time. That return does not erase the Atlantic. It does not undo the auction block. It does not cancel the plantation ledger, the colonial flag, the segregated rail car, the red line on the map, the prison statistic, the missing deed, the buried language, or the grandmother's silence. But it changes the grammar in which those things are carried. They become inheritance without becoming destiny. They become warning without becoming identity. They become memory without becoming prison. And once that grammar changes, the whole horizon changes with it. Perhaps the final gift of a forbidden chronology is that it turns the question back on the listener. Not only what happened to us, but what are we now doing with what happened to us? That is where all serious history ends, not in spectatorship, in responsibility. A people can know every date and still remain unchanged. They can memorize ports and judges and decrees and kings and still fail to alter the structures those names point toward. In that sense, chronology is a mirror before it is a map. It shows whether we are using history to enlarge ourselves or merely to wound ourselves more intelligently. This is why the end of the cycle, if there is such an end, cannot simply be the discovery that a long punishment had a number. It must be the discovery that the number never exempted us from building. A measured exile is still exile, a prophesied delay is still delay, and the knowledge that a season was long does not automatically prepare a people for what to do when the season shifts. That unpreparedness may be one reason threshold years feel so unstable. People sense movement before they know how to organize it. They feel old stories weakening before new institutions are ready. They recognize the veil thinning before they have language for the landscape on the other side. This is not failure. It is transition, and transition is rarely graceful when generations have been trained for survival more than sovereignty.
Mom?
This is why so much of the current moment can look contradictory. On one hand, there is extraordinary access to memory. On the other, deep vulnerability to distraction. On one hand, a widening appetite for black historical depth. On the other, relentless pressure to package that depth into entertainment. On one hand, growing transnational awareness. On the other, algorithmic fragmentation. On one hand, spiritual searching. On the other, opportunists ready to monetize confusion. Every threshold comes with false doors. So how do we know the difference between real transition and another loop of the old pattern? One answer is this: real transition increases responsibility. False transition increases spectacle. Real transition deepens study. False transition rewards certainty without labor. Real transition strengthens continuity between elders, adults, and youth. False transition turns every generation into a fresh market segment. Real transition produces institutions that outlive moods. False transition produces moods that feel like institutions. Real transition teaches a people to hold complexity without paralysis. False transition demands immediate total agreement. That distinction is worth guarding in every conversation about Black awakening and prophetic time, because the desire for total explanation is powerful, especially after long injury. But total explanation can become another prison if it leaves no room for evidence, difference, or growth. The point of this chronology is not to close inquiry. It is to enlarge inquiry. To say that the Black Diaspora experience may require bigger frames than we were given, not smaller ones, not flatter ones, bigger. If that is right, then the most faithful response to the chronology is not blind certainty, it is disciplined enlargement. Enlarge the family record, enlarge the reading list, enlarge the economic imagination, enlarge the spiritual conversation, enlarge the geographic scale, enlarge the definition of restoration, enlarge the expectation placed on institutions, enlarge the future beyond mere reaction. That is how a people step out of a sentence without becoming defined by the sentence. And maybe that is the final meaning of the forbidden in forbidden chronology. Not simply hidden dates, not simply suppressed prophecy, but a larger story people were never meant to hold comfortably. A story in which Black suffering is not peripheral, but central to the making of the modern order. A story in which delayed restoration is not incidental but patterned. A story in which the descendants of dispersion are no longer willing to let official timelines reduce them to aftermath. That story does not belong to one denomination, one ideology, one movement, or one platform. It belongs to a question. What kind of people do we become when we finally refuse small timelines? That question is still open, but perhaps the opening itself is the sign. For centuries, too much of Black historical time was written as closure by others. Closed auction books, closed school doors, closed neighborhoods, closed archives, closed futures. To live in a threshold moment is to feel that closure weakening, not vanishing, weakening, enough to let another kind of sentence be written, not the sentence of punishment, the sentence of return. Return not always to geography, not always to one ancient identity claim neatly resolved, but return to scale, return to sequence, return to memory, return to moral proportion, return to the right to plan beyond survival, return to the right to be interpreted by one's own depth rather than by the administrative categories of those who profited from diminishment. If that return is underway, then the Black Diaspora stands in one of the most consequential positions in the modern world, not merely as a community asking for overdue justice, but as a people testing whether history itself can be re-narrated from below, whether the victims of dispersion can become the authors of a larger civilizational account, whether a broken timeline can become the very site where a new one begins. That possibility is too large to reduce to hype, too serious to flatten into slogan, too consequential to leave at the level of intrigue. It asks for patience, for evidence, for imagination, for build capacity, for mercy, for rigor, and for the courage to believe that after centuries of measured diminishment, measured restoration might also be possible, not automatic, not magical, but possible. And if possibility is real, then the old count, however one interprets it, no longer functions only as a curse. It becomes a summons to stop living as fragments, a summons to stop beginning the story at the ship, a summons to stop mistaking survival for completion, a summons to prepare children for inheritance, not merely defense, a summons to insist that memory, once recovered, must be converted into structure, a summons to meet the future as though Black time is not an appendix to world history, but one of the places where world history is being judged. That is the mirror. And once you have looked into it, the old timelines never feel quite sufficient again. And maybe that is where the whole meditation was always heading. Not to the thrill of decoding a secret number, but to the sobering recognition that a people long pushed through displacement, misnaming, extraction, segregation and delay may now be standing in an interval where excuses are losing power. Not all power, but some. Enough, perhaps, that younger generations can inherit more than warning. Enough that archives once closed can become tools rather than mausoleums. Enough that Black historical thought can move from reaction to authorship. Enough that restoration can be planned in public language rather than whispered as impossible hope. If the 7 times framework has any enduring worth, maybe it is this. It refuses to let the Black Diaspora story remain shallow. It refuses neat timelines of liberal progress. It refuses to let captivity be treated as incidental to modernity. It refuses to let the beginning of Black historical meaning be placed at the moment of European possession. It insists on moral scale, temporal scale, and civilizational scale. That insistence matters even for those who will never accept the arithmetic literally. Because a people do not need perfect consensus on prophecy in order to agree that their timeline was interrupted, colonized, and minimized. They do not need agreement on ancient start dates to recognize that the long afterlife of bondage structured the present. They do not need one doctrinal lens to know that memory, institution, dignity, and future planning have to be reclaimed together. Perhaps that is the broadest reading available to us, that the forbidden timeline, whether prophetic fact or interpretive mirror, has become useful because it breaks the habit of small explanations, and small explanations have cost too much. They have cost children their scale, families their continuity, communities their confidence, institutions their ambition, and nations the honesty required to tell the truth about how modern wealth, law, and order were built. So we end not with a perfect solved code, but with a sharper responsibility. Learn the history deeply enough that spectacle cannot fool you. Build strongly enough that awakening does not evaporate into mood. Remember broadly enough that the story no longer begins at the point of captivity. And plan far enough ahead that the next generation inherits structure, not just survival. That may be the most faithful way to live at the edge of a possible ending. Not by waiting for history to announce itself, by becoming the kind of people who are ready when it does.